Security tab is where everything happens. Well, not everything, but that's probably the more elaborate or more complex tab because it has sub-tabs and each of them has some sub-options sometimes. So let's have a look step by step. When you click security, you get into the layer 2 security tab. And this is where your layer 2 802.11 security will be set. And as you can see, the default is WPA/WPA-v2. This is what you should keep. And by default as well, we use WPA-v2 AES policy and we use 802.1x. You can change that settings to something else. You can set to known where there is no security, and you can use these other modes that you don't want to use again. .1x, that's dynamic web, so you would use .1x and then generate a web key based on that .1x. Again, that's there if you need it. You probably don't want to use that. And then there is the other mode, which is static web or static plus 802.1x, and even an older mode called CKIP, and none plus IP pass-through where you do IP except for people who cannot do it, etc. So there are a few technical modes that you can use, but in most cases you want to use the default WPA-v2. Then of course you may not need to use .1x, but WPA-v2 is the one you want to use. If you need to, you can also enable WPA for backward compatibility, and by default it's going to come up with AES, but you can also turn on TKIP if you need to. But again, if your clients are not more than 10 years old, you probably want to use WPA-v2 only. Then key management can be .1x or can be pre-shared key. Notice that if you do pre-shared key, you will define the key here because the controller needs to know the key. But if you say .1x, notice that you do not tell the controller what the security is going to be, in the sense that you don't say what IP process you're going to use. PIP, TLS, IPFAS, you don't say that. And the reason is because the controller doesn't care. The controller just needs to know if you define the PMK locally, that's pre-shared key, or if the radius is going to take care of your dialog and authentication, and that's IP.1x. What sub-IP you're going to use? Not my problem, it's between the client and the authentication server. So the IP process is never defined at the SSID level because the controller doesn't need to know that. Okay, what you need to set just is radius or local. There's also a mode which is called CCKM, which is for fast roaming. Remember CCX, Cisco compatible extensions, where we can handle fast roaming for clients that support the CCX protocol. That's 70% of the industry. If you do so, it can be still pre-shared key or .1x, but we'll have a special way of handling the key and passing it along from one AP to the other. And clients using CCX will recognize that special mode and will not even try to re-authenticate as they roam because they'll know that the key will be passed around. Nice way, nice mode, very fast, but you need to make sure that your clients are CCX if you want to use it. There is also the other mode, which is the 802.11 way of doing fast transition, FT 802.11r. If you check that box, then you enable 802.11r, which can be enabled in coordination with some other mechanism, right? It's just something you add on top. So if you do WPA-v2 pre-shared key, you will do pre-shared key and also 11r for those clients that support it. And then you can decide if the fast transition is going to happen over the air or over the DS. Remember, we discussed that in previous lessons. And when you do this pre-authentication, there is the reassociation timeout below that says how long do you give to that client that asks for this pre-authentication before you decide that the client is not coming to you and you just release the pre-shared key or the credential for that client. So again, all SSIDs that you enable FT on are going to be dual, hybrid. They will do FT and they will also do the other default mode. So in my example here, I'll be doing pre-shared key and FT. So 11R stations are going to associate with 11R, and non-11R stations that do not understand FT are going to use the default pre-shared key WPA-v2. Notice that there are some old clients, as we said, that may not understand this dual mode because they do not recognize FT. And these old clients, although they could use WPA-v2 pre-shared key, may panic because they don't recognize the other one and they want to make sure they recognize everything before joining. And those old clients might not join an SSID where you enable FT. In that case, there is not much of a choice. You have to disable FT if you want those clients to join, or upgrade those clients' operating system to something newer where they understand that they just need to have one of the security mechanisms and not both to be able to join the cell. And this dual mode is the reason why when you enable FT, you have now pre-shared key and FT pre-shared key. And you define the key, of course, only once, but you use that pre-shared key for both mechanisms, FT and the normal WPA-v2. The same goes if you do .1x, right? You can say 802.1x and FT802.1x, and the controller nicely warns you that non-11R clients, and it doesn't say, but older non-11R clients may not be able to join the SSID. That's a problem you see less and less, but that's still valid in some old Apple operating systems. Some old laptops operating systems as well may not be FT compliant, and they have not updated because they do not expect that with a laptop you will need to have fast transition. So that's something you may still see in larger devices. BYODs most of the time are either FT compatible or FT compliant, so they can use FT, and if they can't, they understand that they can use the other one. All right, if you do not use layer 2 security, that is to say you don't use the 1x, .pav2, etc., you can also do web authentication. So in that case, you would set your layer 2 security typically to none. You could still use a pre-shared key in combination with layer 3 security, but most of the time you use one or the other. So you set layer 2 to none, and then if you go to layer 3 security tab, then you can set it to web authentication. There is a warning about DNS because to do web authentication policies, we'll need to have some DNS exchange for your client to be able to resolve the IP address of a web server it may be trying to go to. So that opens the system to what we call a DNS attack, so that's always possible. So there's a warning saying, hey, be careful, we will not be stopping DNS here for that mode because we need DNS to be able to know where a client is trying to go. Okay. The default mode is authentication, which means that you're going to authenticate users on the controller. Remember LWA? That's where it is. You can also set it to pass through, which means that we just let users through. They just have to check a checkbox saying that they agree to conditions of use, etc., with or without an email input, just for validation of who they are. And you can also use this conditional web redirect, where you will be redirecting them after authentication, or splash page web redirect, where you redirect them to an external server before authentication. There is also this mode where you use web authentication in combination with MAC filtering, where if MAC filter fails, then you revert to web authentication. But most of the time you'll be using the default, which is authentication. Now let's go to the last tab, AAA servers. So this is whenever you use some authentication, you can decide where the authentication is going to happen. So you have some defaults, controllers and Radius servers defined here in security authentication. So we don't have a Radius here, but that's where you will create your Radiuses. And then you'll decide if the authentication is going to go through these Radiuses. And if you use local authentication on the controller, you can subcontract the authentication to an external LDAP server. So you can either use Radius externally or use local authentication on the controller, in which case you can use a local database of users or subcontract to an LDAP server the task of making sure that we have groups and users. Okay, so let's go back to our AAA server tab, which is here in security. So you see no authentication server has been defined, which means that we're basically using the defaults that we have in the security list. You don't need to do anything here, except if you have several servers in the Radius list and you want to call a different sequence than the one which is in security. So if you want for that SSID to use the third server instead of the first one by default, you would put the server 1 as being the third in the list in sequence. That allows you to change the default calls sequence on the Radius servers if there is a reason why you want to use a specific Radius for that SSID. If you don't set anything here, it's just going to go to the security tab, pick the first one in the list that's responding, and ask there. If you want to use local authentication, you would check this box, local IP authentication, and I'll show you in next lesson how this is configured. In that case, you do not use the external Radius server anymore. You're just going to use the internal Radius server, which is not a full Radius, but Radius server on the controller. And when you do so, and if you use web authentication, you can also decide where you want to authenticate your users. So that's specifically for web authentication. You have a sequence where you first check locally, in which case you don't check outside, or you can change the sequence to say, I want to check first Radius and then LDAP, etc. You can have a sort of priority list of where you want to check for your user identity. Last note, this Radius server override interface. By default, if you use a Radius, the controller is going to use its management interface IP address to talk to the Radius server. If you don't want to use the management interface IP address, but you want to use the IP address of the interface associated to the SSID, VLAN 23 in this case, to talk to the Radius server. So if you want your controller source IP address to be, instead of what you see at the top, 172.31.255.30, if you want it to be instead 10.10.23 something, what I configure for the interface, then you can check that box. And that allows you to use a different source IP address to talk to your Radius server. In most cases, you don't need that feature. It's an advanced feature. In some cases where there are different Radius servers based on different SSIDs, and therefore the source IP address you use to talk to them might be different.